Hola, buenas tardes, bienvenidas y bienvenidos todos y todas a esta nueva conferencia del ciclo de conferencias de innovación para la transformación social y ambiental. Esta es nuestra quinta conferencia. Estamos muy contentas porque ya se ha inaugurado el posgrado en innovación para la innovación social y ambiental, y bueno, esta es la primera conferencia que forma parte del currículum del posgrado, o sea que muy satisfechas de que esto haya podido ocurrir. Y nada, y con muchas ganas de escuchar a Laura Pereira, que es nuestra conferenciante en el día de hoy. Ella, precisamente estamos hablando en el posgrado de las transiciones, de las transitions, ¿no? Y bueno, este ha sido un poco el motivo de invitar a Laura a que compartiera con nosotras esta sesión. Ella es originalmente de Johannesburgo, es sudafricana, pero tiene una trayectoria muy extensa, ¿no?, de vinculación con institutos de investigación de diferentes partes del mundo, ¿no? Yo creo que Laura es zoóloga, ecóloga y de formación original, pero luego pues ha estado trabajando en Oxford, en Harvard, en diferentes espacios que tienen que ver con la naturaleza, la sociedad, la política ambiental. Ha trabajado mucho también el análisis de los sistemas de alimentación, los food systems también. Tiene experiencia de trabajo en diferentes lugares del mundo, en Sudáfrica, por supuesto, pero también tiene experiencia de trabajo en Brasil, en Colombia, en Mozambique, en Nigeria. O sea, tiene como esa visión también muy interesante, ¿no?, de perspectivas de las transiciones desde el sur, ¿no?, desde el Global South, ¿no?, que también es muy interesante para hablar de un modelo de transiciones justas y ambientalmente sostenibles. Ella ahora mismo está vinculada al Stockholm Resilience Center, que es un centro de investigación muy prestigioso en estos temas, pero también mantiene su vinculación con la Universidad de Wits. Bueno, tiene un nombre más largo, pero yo la corto, en Johannesburgo, ¿no?, en Sudáfrica, con un centro también de transformaciones y cambio. Y bueno, el tema del que nos va a hablar es sobre futuros, cómo trabajar con escenarios de futuro, precisamente para poder ir o para transitar hacia un modelo más justo y más sostenible. Laura, the floor is yours. Thanks a lot for being here with us in this very special moment for us, because we are starting our diploma and this topic is especially relevant. And yes, the floor is yours, and we are going to listen to you very carefully. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Sandra. And yes, apologies. I will be giving the presentation in English, but it has been translated to Spanish on the slides, and please feel free to ask your questions in Spanish. It's just that teaching in Spanish is not my strong point, but lovely to be here with you all. And I'm now sharing. I think everyone can see my slides. And so, yeah, the topic that I wanted to sort of have a conversation with you about today is about imagining better futures for people and the planet. And there are a lot of interesting techniques that we've been working with over the years to sort of hopefully explore the relationship between the future and this idea of transformation and transition. And in particular, as I think we all know, we're sitting in this new epoch called the Anthropocene, where humans have become the dominant sort of force of change on the planet. And they've had this large-scale impact over the past, particularly over the past 50 to 60 years, but especially after the Industrial Revolution too. And this has not just led to environmental impacts, as we've been using increasingly more natural resources to meet prosperity or to sort of meet our needs, but has also resulted in a lot of inequality. So growing inequities between the North and the South, between those who are able to access resources and those who can't. And so this crisis or this challenge of the Anthropocene is not just about sustainability or sort of getting our environmental footprint in check, but it's also sort of fundamentally about social justice. And so you can see from these images here that there are a lot of wicked challenges that we need to be confronting when we think about sort of what better futures could actually look like, because we know we're currently on a very sort of linear trajectory. We think about climate change, we think about biodiversity loss that's leading us to a pretty bad place in the future. And so what is the transformation? What are the kinds of transitions that we need to be able to address this? And this is where I really like this quote from Lao Tzu, who sort of talks to, if you don't change direction, you may end up where you are heading. And I think that that's very much the story of sustainability. We talk about bending the biodiversity curve. We talk about sort of the need to sort of bend the hockey stick back when it comes to carbon emissions so that we're actually able to stabilize global temperatures. But, in order to do this, we need to change direction. We need to be doing something different. And this is where I think the relationship between transitions, transformations theory, and the future becomes really important to grapple with, because the direction that we want to navigate towards, the transition that we want to sort of advocate for, requires us to think about what that future could look like. And so if we sort of think back to, for example, the medieval Europe, and think if you were a peasant farmer sort of sitting there in the 1300s, the idea of the Industrial Revolution would have been so foreign, such a strange concept for you to actually imagine. And yet the seeds, the ideas of what led to that future were already sitting sort of with us. And so it emerged in the Industrial Revolution. And we need a similar kind of transformation, a similar kind of way of thinking of what could the possible future be if we're going to be more sustainable, if we're going to have a more equitable sort of future planet. What are those kinds of sort of transformative changes that we need to be actually, to allow us to start to think about what we can do in the present. And so that's kind of the background of where I see this idea of thinking about the future linking up to sort of transitions and transformations thinking. But sort of largely, especially with the natural sciences, we tend to project sort of what's happened before into the future. And so sort of this quote by Riel Miller, who's the UNESCO chair in futures studies, sort of he says that when the future is predicted from, what we know or what's kind of probable, it's actually generally out of date. Yeah. So that's not necessarily how the future is going to play out. And so if we keep on thinking about the future as a linear trajectory from the past, then we're not going to have the necessary capacities or the future's literacy, as he would call it, to be able to actually deal with the kind of change that's going to emerge, or to steer the kind of change that we know needs to happen in order to get us to a more sustainable future. So I really like this cone by Voros, who first published it in 2003, and then you can see there's a link here about an updated version on his blog. But if you see sort of time across the bottom, so we're sitting in this present, and the future is this open cone in front of us. And what we tend to focus on is this kind of central part, the projected future. So this is the business as usual, or sort of what we extrapolate from what's currently happening. And this is generally a lot of what we see with sort of, if we continue to have carbon emissions or sort of the burning of fossil fuels at the current rates, these are the kinds of futures that we can expect, right? It's just projecting what's gone before into the future. We then have this idea of probable futures, right, which are about kind of current trends. So if the trends that we see now, what is likely to happen? So you look at urbanization, for example, on the African continent, where it's likely to continue to happen, it's likely to increase. These are sort of within this blue space, probably things that we can think are going to happen in the future. Within sort of the scenario space, particularly thinking about the shared socioeconomic pathways that are the scenarios used sort of by the IPCC to think about futures for climate change models, there's a real engagement with this idea of plausible futures. So this is about sort of based on our current knowledge, what could actually happen in the future, what's plausible. So that's also, it's a slightly bigger, but sort of still quite a small piece of this, this future pie. And so we sort of, those of us who've been working in futures thinking in the space have sort of argued that we need to grow this. We actually need to start thinking about possible futures. What are the kinds of futures that might actually happen? And this is also very subjective. So what you think is possible may not be what I think is possible. And so sort of it opens up a much bigger space of what we think could actually emerge in the future. And then even more exciting for me, I think, is this preposterous future where people are thinking that's impossible, it will never happen. And this comes back to sort of the slide I was showing on the Industrial Revolution, that even if we think now in 1950, no one would have thought that we'd have cell phones, that we'd have the internet, that we'd be flying around sort of everywhere, being able to access all sorts of places, that kind of technology or that level of globalization would have been preposterous, I think, for a lot of our grandparents, for example, to think about. And yet it's exactly what happened. So arguably, one could say that maybe these preposterous futures are the ones that are actually more likely or more probable to happen. And so we really need to explore this whole range of the future in order to be able to train our minds to think about what could happen, and to also train ourselves to understand that the future is sort of uncertain. And this green slice of the pie over here is where I really like to do a lot of work, which is around preferable futures. So out of all of these futures that could emerge, what are the ones that we actually would like to see happen, right? So this is where the transition, this is where the transformation happens. It's about how can we move away from this projected future and move it towards the preferable futures that we actually want to see happen, the kinds of sustainable, just, equitable futures that we know that we actually need for people in the planet. So this sort of green area across all of this is what I'm going to largely be talking about today. And so how do we actually enable this plurality of possible futures that are preferable, right? And that they are transformative by definition and not just plausible. And there are a variety of different techniques for doing that. And I will sort of be sharing some of these during the course of the talk. But one of the big ones, the main ones, has been the Seeds of Good Anthropocenes project that I've been involved in. And this is these images are from a paper led by Chiara Ratzep-Hearn in 2019. And it basically just goes to illustrate how starting from small seeds, ideas of things that are happening in the present, and sort of clashing them in interesting ways and coming up with these really sort of intersecting pathways, you can actually get to very different kinds of future narratives of where people would like to move towards. That seeds of that we can be talking about later, and I'll give an example of some other sort of tools and heuristics that can be used in this space. But what I wanted to do quickly, and especially for those, well, everyone's online, and it's not sort of a conventional lecture where I can see everyone, but I thought we'd all just take a moment, and if you're sort of on YouTube and you can write in the chat there or the comment section, maybe you can just think of what word kind of best describes how you think about the future. And this is coming from an exercise from the West 2017 Futures Thinking Playbook. And here's some examples, but again, there's no wrong answer here. So just feel free to just think about it and put something out there, see what everyone else is also thinking, and see whether there's some of you who have similar words or some that have very different words describing how they think about the future. Because that's sort of the beauty of this process, is that we're all sort of different in how we're doing that. So I'll let you do that and sort of think about that, and feel free to just continue to write in the chat, or to just think about it for yourself. And now I also just wanted to have a little bit more of a reflection session. And so this is another exercise from that playbook, which is about your futures thinking personality type. And so there are kind of 4 different types of future thinking personalities. The first one is the kind of the observer, and they are and people who sort of see what's happening around them, and sort of people with this personality type believe that they can sort of note down what will happen, and that their role is to kind of see and note down things, but not necessarily to actually affect any change. And so they tend to be people who sort of like are able to capture a lot of what's going on around them and sort of really up to speed with current ways of thinking. There's then also the navigator type. So these sort of navigators kind of know where they want to sort of steer their boat towards, but they also know that we have to take individual responsibility to be able to sort of like steer this boat in that direction. And so they know that the future is not determined, but that our individual actions like might sort of have some influence. And so they're sort of really sort of trying to take charge of a situation, and they're very confident and decisive, and they want to limit the amount of uncertainty in a situation. So they don't like kind of having this open sort of future in front of them. They want to make sure that there's quite a lot of control. You then have the B types, and so the first one of the sort of B is the explorer. And they kind of see a wide range of possibilities in front of them. And sort of people with this future personality type sort of believe that the future isn't yet determined and that our individual actions don't have much influence. They're often dreamers and can kind of see the best in many types of situations. So they're always thinking about sort of what good could start to emerge. And then finally, and this is generally where I tend to land up, is the map maker. And sort of they have the entire ocean, or that full range of possibilities, the whole cone kind of open in front of them. And they also believe that, our decisions and actions can actually help determine how the future plays out. So there is a level of control or agency that we have. They're often imaginative, sort of optimistic, and ready to take charge. And the whole idea behind just exploring this is that there's no right or wrong kind of personality. We all think about the future in different ways, and maybe even at different times we think about the future in different ways. So maybe today I'm thinking more like a map maker, but tomorrow I might be sort of really not wanting to deal with the uncertainty, and so I'd be thinking more of an explorer or an observer. So just to sort of put that out there, and there's actually, you can sort of run the little game with questions with your colleagues if you want to do an exploration amongst yourself. Again, it's in that Futures Thinking playbook, this exercise. And then I also just wanted to run through a series of questions, just sort of like true or false. Again, coming back to this idea of projection, and maybe this is something that we could also just put into the chat, and I won't be able to kind of see what the range of answers are, but just seeing if this gets you, sort of stimulates for you to think in different ways. So the first question is like that the global population is going to reach 11 billion by 2050. Is that true or false? Do we know? Maybe to meet SDG 2, which is to eliminate hunger, that Africa needs to intensify its agricultural production systems. That could be another, is that true? Is that false? Sort of thinking about 2030 as a future point, like what needs to happen in order for this to be achieved. Maybe also if sort of economic development continues, China is going to eat a diet that's a lot more Western. Is that how the future is going to play out? Is that true? Is that false? Maybe we need to sort of double global food production by 2050 in order to sort of meet food security needs of everyone. Is that true? Is that false? What do we think? I know that there's some on the call who would really be liking to have a discussion on this, some of my colleagues. And then maybe just in order to be financially viable in the future, sort of small scale producers need to consolidate. So they need to move away from small farms and sort of have bigger areas of land in order to be financially viable. Do we think that's true? Or do we think that's also a false statement? So these are all questions about how the future will play out. Yeah, sort of that we quite often take for granted when we're thinking about development, for example. So just some thinking along those lines. And the final one is that by 2050, 60% of Latino Americanos will live in urban areas. So sort of that will be the level of urbanization in Latin America by 2050, 60%. So pretty high. It's currently where South Africa is. Just wondering how everyone's thinking about that. But I mean, the truth is that obviously in reality, we don't know because the future is uncertain. Yeah. So a lot of these statements we take for granted are based on sort of assumptions of how the future will play out based on current trends or current dynamics. And so I really like this quote by Sada in his paper in 2010, which sort of says, predictions are epistemol activities, right? And so that they don't actually produce knowledge about the future itself. All they can do is sort of kind of help us to sort of come up with a limited number of possibilities. But in particular of emphasis, like the exploration of the future can't be sort of a quest for certainty. It's never about certainty. It's in the future. It's uncertain, right, by definition. And so we need to always bear this in mind when we're thinking about the future. So why do we even bother thinking about the future? And this is where this concept of anticipatory governance becomes quite important. And there's a paper by a colleague years before it and Gupta in 2018 that talks about this idea of anticipatory governance. Sorry, I just need to get some water quickly. Hi, sorry about that. Got something stuck in my throat. Anticipatory governance, sorry, I'm back, is basically about sort of improving, building our capacities to think about the future and to use the future to make better decisions in the present. And so we don't think about the future because that's necessarily where we want to go. We think about the future so that we can sort of see how it would play out in the decisions we take in the present. And that's really the main reason why we're thinking about the future. And also why... Sorry, I've got something stuck in my throat. Yeah, and why future thinking is so important. So just some terminology so that everyone kind of understands that there are different ways of thinking about the future. So the first sort of rule or the first law of the future is that you can't really predict things, but you can kind of sort of think about alternative futures, and you can also like visualize and invent this in a kind of continual basis, what kind of preferable futures you might want to have. Sort of foresight is kind of looking about the knowledge of the future and the present, and it tends to be a little bit more corporate, and sort of this idea of like scenario planning where you have these strategic goals that you want to achieve and sort of you use foresight there. Whereas future studies kind of emphasizes more the plurality and diversity of the different types of futures that are there. It really has an emphasis on sort of breaking this notion of of a colonized future that's been determined by sort of a group of kind of strong actors, or the most powerful. And then there's also the discipline of anticipation. So that's sort of coming back to this idea of anticipatory governance. This discipline sort of thinks that we need to be able to anticipate what might be happening in the future in order to make better decisions in the present. So the 4 laws of future studies, also according to Sardar, is that sort of future studies are wicked, right? They're complex. So they're really sort of concerned with thinking about sort of complex and interconnected problems. They're also sort of mad. This is Dema sort of emphasizing la diversidad mutuamente asegurada, and that there are different ways of kind of being human, and so that there are always going to be different ways of thinking about the future. And sort of within our sort of collective humanity, we need to make sure that that diversity is maintained, and that we recognize it. And you can sort of see the full Spanish explanation here that's I typed out for you. They're also sort of skeptical, right? Again, they don't just think that what's gone before is going to continue to happen. Kind of they question sort of dominant assumptions about how the world's going to be in the future. And this is the other interesting thing, is that they're futureless. You know, future studies are sem futuro. They sort of actually take root largely in the present, right? Because sort of we think about the future again to make decisions in the present. And so these are some just interesting things to bear in mind when we're thinking about the future. And so again, I mentioned that I was going to sort of share some tools that we use to think about things in the future. And I see I'm already at half an hour, so I'm going to start moving a little bit faster. But so example, we can have sort of heuristic devices like the 3 horizons approach. Also just talk quickly about scenarios and models and how they kind of connect largely in the global environmental change sphere, and then quickly about science fiction prototyping. And then I'm going to share a game with everyone that you guys can play, and then hopefully we can have some interaction about that afterwards. So heuristic devices, for example, the iceberg model, is really important for us to sort of think a bit more deeply about why we see the things play out in the way that they do. So we quite often see events happen, yeah? So sort of events are the top, they're the actual iceberg that we see. But these events are caused by particular patterns, and they're sort of, again, organized by the kinds of way that things are structured. And that comes down to actually our mental models, like how we actually see the world play out. So if you look at an event around food insecurity, for example, happening, sort of that could be about sort of patterns that are happening, let's say, a drought hit, and so we were unable to actually sort of grow enough food, and so you got a food crisis. But maybe that's actually because the underlying structures that were supposed to be allocating food to different areas, like, weren't actually set up in order to do that, right? And so they were a lot more vulnerable to that drought, sort of that weather pattern happening. And that could be basically because we think that trade is going to solve everything. For example, our mental model is such that we think that is the way that if an event were to happen, that we just be able to get food from everywhere else. But actually, you know, our structures, our systems haven't been set out to do that. And so it's really important to be able to see the whole iceberg, not just the event. And so because a lot of the interventions, again, thinking about transformation or transition, is about getting to those mental models and changing the way that we see the world, so that the rest kind of emerges from there. There's also this idea of preferable futures, and I really like this quote by Roa Benjamin, who sort of says that we need to remember to imagine and craft the worlds we can't live without, just as we dismantle the ones we can't live within. And I think that this is exactly what the 3 horizons framework, which you can see, is doing. And basically, it starts at the bottom left-hand corner with time across the bottom, in sort of marginal things that are not sort of dominant at the moment, but that we want to kind of see emerge and grow into the top right-hand corner, which is the 3rd horizon, which is the better future that we kind of envision for ourselves. Well, we also need to recognize that we're sitting in the present, that we have this sort of first horizon, this red line, which is the dominant system, the dominant way of doing things, or business as usual, which we've heard before, and that in order for this new system to emerge, the old system needs to decline over time. And for that to happen, we have this messy intersection, which is the second horizon, which is about, as these systems clash against each other, what is it that starts to emerge? What are the things we need to do in order to enable that third horizon, that preferable, better future to actually emerge? Again, largely sort of taken from transformations thinking. There's also this idea of visioning. So like what that top right-hand corner actually looks like is going to be different for different people, because we all have different values, different things that we think are important to take into the future. And so, these are about stories about the future that sort of touch our hearts and our minds. And so you can have a potential to be much more creative and communicate. You can see here we had a whole lot of images that were developed for this Nature Futures visioning process, or the workshop we ran in Auckland in 2017. And you can also see visions at different levels, right? Different scales, sort of both from your very local community to all the way up to kind of at the planetary level. What are the kinds of visions or the stories you want to tell ourselves about a future? You can use a variety of different methods for them. And they can also form the base of scenarios. And scenarios tend to be a lot more quantitative. So that's a starting point to be able to have more creative scenarios, and can be done with different people in different places, different interests, and so you can get a much bigger diversity of voices into the discussion. You then have sort of very conventional kind of scenarios, which I think a lot of people are familiar with. They're kind of just plausible descriptions about how sort of the future might develop over time, sort of based on assumptions that are coherent and internally consistent. And that's a really important component to bear in mind. Again, emphasizing just a small component of the future cone that we saw. But they can be used, and they have been used in different parts of the decision-making sort of cycle. So both this exploratory scenarios to think about what is the range of possible things that could happen, then target seeking, more normative, where they're like, we need to get to this point. Like, how is it? What are the different pathways to get there? And then also for specific policies. So, policy screening, if policy A were to play out or policy B were to play out, like where would it get us in terms of the future? Or, if policy A wanted us to get there and we landed up going here, sort of retrospectively, like why did that happen? Sort of reviewing particular policies. You can also do participatory scenario development. So sort of development and the use of exploratory scenarios sort of like helps us actually unpack different solutions and like problems in particular ways. But in particular, it's about improving our capacity to sort of construct or to produce that anticipatory knowledge that we need to be able to take into the future. So this was taken from a set of scenarios that were done in East Africa, and they're sort of looking at sort of very conventional two different drivers of change, one around governance, one around integration, and sort of they were done with a group of stakeholders and government sort of policymakers who were really interested in thinking about these kinds of four extreme sets of where East African agriculture might actually go in the future. And so sort of by being part of that process, you're also building people's capacity to think about the future. Just so it's not necessarily just the end product of the scenario that you're looking at, but the process matters just as much as the product does. And then again, just very quickly, I was mentioning the shared socioeconomic pathways, which is sort of looking at challenges for mitigation and adaptation. And this is what's largely been used for climate change modeling over the different years. And there are 5 different SSPs. So scenarios are quite often sort of tightly coupled to be quantified so that they actually can be included into models. So we can start to put numbers to some of these futures. But there are sort of 4 real big challenges thinking about the future. And the first is about scale, right? It's really difficult to think about futures operating in different scales because there is so much sort of interaction and connectivity between things, and that can be difficult for decision makers to be able to sort of take these multiple different scales into account. Surprise is also really difficult to incorporate, particularly in quantified models, right? Because the whole point of surprise is that we can't really anticipate it. It comes out of nowhere. So can we use techniques like wildcards, where we're thinking about a future that we're like, no, that's crazy, that's never going to happen, but can we still try and think about it in order to be able to build our capacity to think about and then to make decisions that could take these potential sort of futures into account. There's also diversity. Again, as I said, everyone has different kinds of ideas of what they think of could be a better or more preferable future. In different places around the world, you're going to have different kinds of impacts playing out, and so that diversity is really important to take into account. And this idea of the imagination, it's not a linear extrapolation to the future. We need to be a lot more creative in how we're thinking about and telling these stories about the future to each other. And so there's kind of a movement to really try and, again, here, bend the curve, think about the sort of transformative changes that we need to get away from an unsustainable future into a much more plural sort of desired future aiming towards SDGs, but also understanding that there are multiple coexisting pathways to these kinds of sustainable futures and that we need to be able to unpack those. And this is sort of based on a paper by a colleague of mine, Ana Paula Aguiar. And so this key capacity that we talk about is this imagination, this idea of the imagination. And so I was mentioning science fiction prototyping is another tool that we tend to use in the futures thinking space. So this is an image from the Radical Ocean Futures project that my colleague Andrew Merry led, working with an artist who actually constructed these incredible visualizations of what some of these futures could look like. And they actually showcased them at the UN in New York. I think it was in 2019 at the launch of the UN Ocean Decade for Ocean Science. That was it. And also around sort of SDG 14, I think, is life underwater. So this was an inspiration for the project that then led to the game that I'm going to ask everyone to play in a few moments. Was that we need to be thinking, like, if we can be a lot more radical, again, opening up preposterous futures, right? Opening up that whole space of what might play out in the future. What would those stories look like? And we sort of can use key insights from science fiction, from literature, the arts and humanities to help us actually explore that future space. And we're trying to do that within the IPBES, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, where I sit on the task force on scenarios and models, and we've developed sort of the Nature Futures Framework, or here el marco de futuros de la naturaleza. And in essence, you've got a triangle where the bottom right-hand corner sort of is talking about nature for society, sort of where nature is valued for its instrumental sort of value, where we're getting food and shelter and other components sort of from it. But that's not the only value that we have for nature. So we also have the sort of top corner, the nature for nature, which is where we're trying to explore intrinsic values for nature, that nature has a right to exist in and of itself, sort of separate from humans. And then the bottom left-hand corner is nature as culture, where we're sort of having relational values for nature, where we're not even able, in the way we think about the world, to divide it between people and nature, that there's a value that's just fundamentally about this interconnectedness, and a lot of indigenous ways of knowing and being in the world sort of take that perspective. So within that triangle, there's an infinite range of potential value combinations that are preferable for nature. And so can we actually explore those, not just focusing on things that we can measure, which is largely instrumental value, but taking into account these other important aspects and doing it at different scales and in different places, which is the image you're seeing on the right-hand side, that, we can have different emphasis in different parts of the triangle in different places, but ultimately the idea is to expand away from just focusing on social values or instrumental values into a much bigger piece of the pie, to be able to get some of that diversity into the mix, and to also recognize what's outside of the triangle, that there are also definitely a lot of unpreferable futures that are starting to emerge from us, and that it's important for us to recognize that. So this is just a quick video of the Seeds project that I wanted to play for everyone. And this is the kind of the final tool that I was mentioning around how we could start from sort of small initiatives that are happening around us and build them into much bigger, kind of more impactful futures. And this is, rather than me going through the process, I think this video details it really, really well about the project we did in Southern Africa. So I'm going to play that quickly for everyone, and then just do a few wrap-up slides before I share the game. So hopefully everyone is still there and still with me. It's really strange talking to an empty screen, but I hope you're all still there and enjoying. Here we go.
We live in turbulent times and are surrounded by visions of dark and uncertain futures. Societies are changing, and people are transforming the environment, the entire planet, in unexpected ways. In many places, we are increasingly disconnected from nature and from each other. These are key symptoms of a new geological era, which scientists call the Anthropocene. But there is hope. There are seeds of positive futures all around us. Seeds of good Anthropocenes. These seeds are projects, organizations, initiatives that are experimenting with doing things differently and making an impact for the better. Better for people and better for our planet. But for now, these seeds are small, local, and not part of the mainstream. What would happen if these seeds were to grow? If they became towering trees with interlocking networks of roots supporting and nourishing each other? What if these seeds became the way we do things, the way the world works? What would the future look like? This is what we asked a group of scientists, artists, and changemakers at a workshop in Cape Town in November 2016. Starting with 4 sets of very different seed projects and initiatives, we asked the participants to imagine what Southern Africa would be like if these seeds were to grow, combine, and become the new normal. We asked them to stretch their imaginations. We asked them to dig deep. As a result, the participants developed 4 radically alternative positive visions for the future. Although these visions differed in their details, they had many striking commonalities. All 4 futures are deeply shaped by technology. This technology is used in a way that enables people to connect to each other, to develop a shared understanding and empathy, rather than become isolated and distrustful. Technological advances also free people up from working just to pay bills. Instead, people work to contribute to their community, live fulfilling lives, and express themselves as human beings. In all 4 futures, power is highly decentralized, and people actively participate in decision-making. Societies are more equal and fair, and value the unique differences between people. Collaboration, rather than competition, is a core ethic. These values extend to humanity's relationship with the environment. Thoughtless exploitation of resources is replaced by responsible stewardship of nature, which is understood to belong to everyone. Most food and other goods are produced locally, minimizing transport and waste. Overconsumption is replaced by flourishing societies in which people respect ecological limits and each other. Idealistic? Yes. Impossibly utopian? No. These are our visions, and the seeds of these futures already exist. Let us nourish them, be inspired to plant more seeds, and let it grow into a beautiful new world.
Great. So that's just a little bit of a taste of the kinds of work we've been doing in the Seeds of Good Anthropocenes project. And again, I'll just say that it was the same method that we used to come up with the Survive the Century game that we're going to play in a little bit. But I just wanted to emphasize that we focused a lot when we're talking about the future on stories. And because, as Alex Evans said, stories are powerful things because they create our reality as much as they kind of explain it. And so this is a quote by Lauren Bjerkes, who says that science fiction kind of actually allows us sort of the distance to be able to kind of remove ourselves from the day-to-day kind of concerns that we have. And because we're sort of creatures of sort of parables and allegories and TED Talks and like surrounded by all of these different narratives around us. And this is how we can actually sort of science fiction, we can use it to help us kind of confront these real concerns that we have and to imagine what could almost be unimaginable, so that we could actually, when we come back to reality, we actually can see how it might be that much better going forward, because those are the kinds of creative tools that we need to be able to bring to bear when we're thinking about the kinds of transformations that we need to be enabling, or the sorts of transition in particular directions that we have the creative capacity to really think beyond the problem of the present. We're not going to be able to do that. So it's a really important capacity that we need to be building amongst ourselves. And sort of finally, this has become really important in the context where I work, coming from South Africa, around this idea of decolonizing futures and sort of decolonizing the narratives of the kinds of futures that are starting to emerge around us. Because as Mbembe Natal said in 2004, sort of Africa's absent from the future. They refer to this continent-sized hole when it comes to actually thinking about stories of the future. And sort of when Africa is there, it's quite often like the immutable. It's sort of another world, the sort of abject that sort of we don't want to go towards. And so what are the kinds of futures that sort of Africans would actually want to be telling about, sort of more just, more sustainable kinds of ways of being in the future? What would that decolonized narrative of the future? And so here you can see a picture of Black Panther, which is sort of one of the strongest narratives, I think, sort of telling a very different kinds of future from the African continent. And this is a quote by Hartman in his anthology on African science fiction, which is sort of refers to it being the only way that actually allows sort of African writers to be able to visualize the future from an African perspective, because it's a it's not just kind of being able to see as another developing country context, but sort of gives them the power and the agency to sort of really transcend that and sort of like talk about a future that hasn't been co-opted by someone else's vision or by the West's vision, but is actually has your own interests at heart. And so those stories are really, really important to be able to foreground. And again, coming back to that idea of diversity, if we don't have a diversity of stories, we're not going to be able to sort of unpack the full potential of the futures that could emerge for us on the planet. And so, humans have changed the way that the world works, and now it's time for us to change how we think about it. And that was already The Economist in 2011. And so what we did is part of a succinct project that ran in 2019, where we were asked to think about much more different, creative, imaginative futures of what could really play out under geoengineering for climate change. We came up with a sort of broader group of experts into the room, used the seeds approach that was in the video, and had some science fiction authors with us too, Mishiga Mohale and Lauren Bjerkes, whose quote you saw there from her Nature paper, and Sam Beck-Bessinger. And what emerged from the discussions was sort of not just necessarily one kind of future, but sort of different branching points of different kinds of futures that might emerge based on key decisions that we'd be making, kind of key transition points in getting to the future. And that turned itself into a choose your own adventure kind of story, right? Where you were able to like go to page 10 if you choose this answer. And so we thought that'd be a really good way to sort of come up with a bit of a game to see if we could make the kinds of decisions that would allow us to survive the century. And so this is the game here. You can find it on survivethecentury.net. And I would really encourage everyone who's listening right now to sort of take the next couple of minutes to log on and sort of maybe play through, see how many decades they could get through. And see whether it helps them think a little bit differently about the kinds of futures that might emerge. And also if you can see the kinds of techniques that I've been mentioning around sort of narratives, around surprise and uncertainty, and all of that sort of starting to emerge, as well as the link to some sort of quantification. So I'm going to stop sharing now, and I think I will return to the others, and I just sort of wait for Sandra to let me know what the timing is.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Muchas gracias. A very interesting and comprehensive overview of what does it mean to work with futures. It's okay if we make a pause of 3-4 minutes, and then maybe people can play with the game, and then we come back and start the Q&A session.
Perfect.
Hacemos una pausa de 4 minutos, 4 minutes.
Yeah, maybe 8. I say at 7 we can come back, ¿no? ¿Es mejor? Tal vez.
Como quieras, pues volvemos a las 7. Yo tengo ya algunas preguntas. I have some questions from the chat. So while we make the pause, I'm going to ask you this question and then you can start answering the question from 7. Great. ¿Ok? Hacemos entonces una pausa de unos hasta las 7, nuestras 7 de la tarde, de 7 minutitos. ¿Vale?
Now it is time to take longer strides. Time for a great new American enterprise.
This center is a part of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration.
This group also supervises research to advance the state of the art.
The ability
Beyond the where the time.
When astronauts Stafford and Cernan systems look good.
Les Naves, el Centre d'Innovació Social i Urbana de València, presenta els seus projectes més punters. Perquè a Les Naves creiem que la innovació no té sentit si no està enfocada a millorar el dia a dia de les persones. Per això desenvolupem projectes amb nom propi que comencen i acaben en la ciutadania, de persones per a persones. Estem oberts per a tu. Vine a conèixer-nos i descobris tot el que estem desenvolupant per a fer de València una ciutat més saludable, sostenible i compartida. Les Naves. Persones innovant per a persones.
La he visto. He visto 1000 veces trabajando junta a esta ciudad, arremangándose cada vez que hacía falta, levantando colosos que el viento se empeñaba en derribar. La he visto infinidad de veces marcarse retos ambiciosos, enormes, de esos a las que otras ciudades difícilmente podrían aspirar. Y hoy esta ciudad vuelve a hacerlo. Vuelve a marcarse un gran desafío que la convertirá en un lugar más sostenible y saludable, más emprendedor y compartido. Un desafío llamado Missions Valencia 2030, para el que necesita tu ayuda. La tuya y la de todas las organizaciones valencianas que son ejemplo de innovación y responsabilidad. Porque todos tenemos la misma meta. Porque elevar una mejor ciudad está en manos de todos. Y porque no hay duda, el futuro es una misión compartida.
Now it is time to take longer strides. Time for a great new American enterprise.
This center is a part of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration.
This group also supervises research to advance the state of the art. The ability beyond where the time.
When astronauts Stafford and Cernan
Systems look good.
Muy bien, pues nada, retomamos la sesión de preguntas y respuestas de la conferencia con Laura Pereira. Yo ya le he planteado las preguntas que estaban en el chat, que se referían un poco a cómo se seleccionan los tipos de metodologías, con qué criterios se selecciona, cómo se manejan expectativas, qué pasa con los participantes más jóvenes. Si decía Guillermo desde el chat que tenían una visión muy pesimista. Bueno, le he planteado las preguntas que salían en el chat y nada, y ahora Laura va a contestarlas o hacer comentarios sobre ellas. Adelante. Yes, please.
Yes. Gracias, Sandra. So good question in choosing methods for visioning futures. And I think I was having this conversation with some students earlier today, actually, and just realizing that there's sort of 3 reasons why we would engage in futures thinking in the first instance. So sometimes it's really just to get an output, the actual story, the actual scenario that we want to mainly use for modeling purposes or other quantification, where quite often we'll get experts into a room and then the kind of method will be based on what that output needs to look like. So if we want to think of different drivers of change, we will use a 4x4 matrix. Quite often we've extended that now, not just to have sort of 2 drivers, but actually maybe a combination or a set so that we can think about the futures in sort of much, much broader ways. So that's one way, sort of more expert driven, sort of thinking really around drivers, for example. I'm thinking of indicators that we might be able to actually measure, metrics that are quantifiable. So if that's a main output, then those are the sorts of methods that we'd be using. There's also just the process in and of itself, that process of thinking about the future with a group of people. Sometimes, this is the participatory side of futures, where the output is important, but actually the process is sometimes a little bit more important. And so that's when you'll choose specific methods to see what is the kind of thinking that you want to get out of the group. Is it about bringing them together to recognize differences? Is it about sort of more imagination and creative thinking, where sometimes you'll bring arts-based methods into play? Is it that they sort of are facing a really challenging problem that they need to be actually unpacking all of these things for? So, there are different methods that you could tailor to those different needs that your group would have. And then there's also sort of the combination of the two, where we actually are concerned about the process of bringing people together as well as the outcome. And that's sort of where we're sitting with the Nature Futures framework of recognizing diversity, but also sort of really needing some narratives, some stories that we can feed into modeling processes at different scales and levels across the world. And then again, we need a combination of what's going to work for the participants to get them to maybe think outside of the box, to also allow them the freedom, the comfort that they can actually tell their own stories or the stories that they want to see, whilst also maybe having something quantifiable that you could put into a model. So, it's really based on the kinds of the rationale or the needs. And that's sort of similar, the criteria that you would then choose is like, how well does this method allow me to achieve what it is I need to do? Because there are a variety of different reasons why we would be thinking about the future. Again, coming back to that policy cycle, sometimes you just want to test how a different policy might be able to achieve some kinds of things, how robust it is when we throw different future worlds at it, at actually still achieving the goals that it's trying to achieve. And that robustness testing has been really important in the CCAF's scenarios project. So hope I answered your question there by being a little bit vague, but also sort of coming back down to the idea that it's it's really the outputs that we're trying to achieve. And with that also comes managing participant expectations. So when you have a participatory process, as with any good participatory process, I think it's not just about extracting information from people, right? Sort of they need to also have a reason to be in the room. And sometimes that's networking. Sometimes that's about learning kind of a new skill or getting some information from being in a process. When we're doing future scenarios work, it's largely around being able to have the space to think more creatively about the future, and then to understand how our actions in the present could help or hinder us from getting towards that future. So quite often those are the expectations we try and lay out at the beginning of a process when we bring people together. It can also be quite uncomfortable for people to think about the kinds of futures that are emerging. And again, that sort of links a little bit to the youth question, is that the kinds of really dire futures that you're seeing emerging from the present right now around climate change, biodiversity loss, even just within governance systems, that I can totally understand why younger participants have a pessimistic perspective. And so I think there's a need to engage them in ways that can actually show what sort of agency we might still have to make that difference, or to actually enact the kinds of changes that we know need to happen going forward. And so I also see this sometimes as an activist kind of process, to be able to allow us to not just think that there's nothing, that the world is just coming at us, that we are also able to exercise some agency to affect that change, or that we need to put pressure on other kinds of actors to be able to affect the kinds of change we know that we need to have, because it's not always at that individual level where you can act. Sometimes it really is that sort of first horizon, breaking that system down can be really difficult to conceptualize, actually. And it's quite interesting on that note, just when we use the 3 horizons, that when we ask people to think of seeds and to think of the kinds of futures they'd like to see, it can be difficult, but once you get them into a creative mode, it's actually quite easy to mark out, oh, if these things were to come together and then we could do that, then, you know, this sort of future would emerge. What's a lot more difficult for people to do is to break down the current system, is to understand like how our business as usual practice actually needs to break before that new system can emerge. And I think that that's where a lot of the pessimism or the sense of a lack of agency really starts to come in. And I don't really have the solution for how we can inculcate that more, other than to keep on trying to have these conversations to be able to spur that change. So that's a combination of expectations, but also sort of really understanding why working with the youth is, why they are sitting at this really, really dystopian time at the moment. And I think that we need to be conscientiously sort of working with them to think through the kinds of futures or the actions we need to take now in order for those futures not to be so bleak. And then there was a final question just on different kinds of sort of serious games, sort of Lego and Minecraft and other things. And I'm definitely not the expert in that, but my colleague Joost Vervoort at Utrecht University is, and he's been doing a lot of interesting work. So we have actually been working on developing a game app for a project we have on climate smart livestock in East Africa, sort of trying to again get beyond COVID, where you couldn't go in and ask people, but to use different kinds of platforms to be able to gauge responses and get a much more interactive process going. So I think the role of games, and hopefully also the Survive the Century one that we were able to play, and hopefully you can continue to play, is one important tool where we're able to both create something that can enable people to think about the future in different ways. There's also the Utrecht 2030 game that I think recently won a prize in the Netherlands for its job working with students and getting them to actually get a lot more connected to their campus and the kinds of sustainability things that they wanted to see. So it's both about getting them to think more deeply, the players to think more deeply, but also to be able to get some information or data from them about the kinds of futures that they think are important, or the kinds of values that they would want to take into a future. So a really big role for that, and I think it's only going to get bigger in the future. I think those are most of the questions, Sandra.
Thanks, Laura. We have a question from our internal team in the diploma. It's from Pablo Fernández Méndez, one of our colleagues working with us in Ingenio. So, Pablo, the floor is yours if you want to pose the question for Laura.
Yes, thank you, Sandra. Thank you, Laura, for this interesting talk and this great overview of futures methodologies also from the philosophical perspective. Very interesting. I have a question. When you use these tools, thinking about the future, I fully agree that the future is incredibly predictable and complex. But there are, when you're working with scenarios, for example, for climate change or resource exploitation, there are certain scenarios that are more probable than others. And in this kind of workshops that you work with stakeholders or a variety and diversity of actors, they are confronted with information and data that are pointing to these likely scenarios or ensemble of scenarios. What do these tools and skills you use bring to the table when trying to work with people that are reluctant or deny or confront this information that is pointing towards a certain direction, and they resist? They are they resist this information and try to divert attention from that. What kind of skills and tools can you use to try to convince them at least to reflect on this information? This is a question that has emerged in our class a couple of hours ago with our students. Thank you.
Okay, sure, Pablo. Thank you for that question. It's I guess that there are different reasons why people would resist, and I think largely what led us into thinking about first the Seeds of Good Anthropocenes project, but also with the Nature Futures framework to focus on preferable futures, not just kind of business as usual futures, is that the science is pretty clear about where we're going if we do nothing, right, in terms of degradation, in terms of climate change. And I think that those are really important honest stories that sort of need to be out there. So I think you can get a resistance about, but it's actually not that bad from a lot of people. It's like, no, if you just sort of take a look at these trajectories, they're really important for us to internalize and to take on board. I think that those sort of dystopian they are dystopian, the kinds of futures that we're facing as a planet. They can also be quite, they can make us sort of lose agency quite a bit, right? Because these problems, these challenges are so complex that what is it that I can do, right? There's clearly, it's like nothing that can actually be done. And so this is where we were thinking about, there's also a need for, because we know the future is uncertain, to think about what are the kinds of alternatives that could emerge, actually, to sort of be able to chart a bit of a path around the kinds of decisions that we might need to take, the kinds of movements, the kinds of interventions, technologies, relationships that we need to build in order to actually move away from these current trajectories. And that's what sparked this emphasis on sort of more preferable futures, that we were trying to also understand that actually sometimes people just have different ideas of what preferable futures actually are, and that diversity or that difference is important to recognize, that maybe we don't have a common understanding as humanity, and so while we can't continue to think that we do necessarily. And this is important with things like the SDGs, where we have these global targets that we're trying to achieve, but they're very different ways of going about achieving them. And I think you're starting to see this clash of different worldviews and perspectives on the how that sort of causes this inertia and inaction, right? Because then we're paralyzed, we can't actually move. And so I think a lot of that resistance can also come from that sense of, well, what is it that we can then do in the face of this, or sort of like not actually being uncomfortable about the kinds of change that we know we actually need to affect. And so I think it's chipping away at the block very slowly with these different narratives, being able to bring people on one at a time and using different kinds of fora. So not just participatory processes necessarily, but again, games, the narratives, the movies, the stories that we actually see around us, I think are also an important part of like cultural engagement with the kinds of futures that might allow us to think about different actions that we could be taking. But I think, I mean, like the questions or the concerns you raise are extremely valid, and we definitely do come up against them in the futures world. But I think we need to recognize sort of why different people are having different kinds of responses, and how we can try and come up with the tools or the engagement that can help bring them along. Because I think that's the point, is that we all need to be brought along. Even from everyone who's kind of causing the problems right now, who's the top 1%, right, who are the most, who are responsible for a large number of the environmental impacts that we're seeing. Getting them to change their ways, right? That's going to require a whole lot of important narrative and pressure. But that's where a lot of the agency lies. So it's it is dealing with transformations is never going to be easy. It's always going to be an ethical act. It's always going to be uncomfortable. Sort of going away from the current trajectory is going to be uncomfortable. But hopefully these tools will give us a little bit of a sense of it's not a black abyss, that there are alternatives, that there are sort of ways of being able to live differently that we can navigate towards. So again, a very nebulous kind of answer to that, not very concrete, but hopefully it talks a bit to just recognizing that those are concerns that we also face in this area.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Laura. We have another question, well, many questions from the chat, but one question is about which methods do you think are more decolonial? So are more respectful with people, imagination, expectations, aspirations, way of doing?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So at least, on the African continent, at least, and this is sort of, again, attributing this to an entire continent, but oral traditions, telling stories is fundamentally part of many cultures that we see there. And so I think, telling stories is therefore an important mechanism that I think allows people to feel a lot more comfortable about these spaces. And you're actually seeing a lot of these new narratives emerging even outside of science, right? In literature, in the humanities. Art in particular, I think, is another really important way that we can be engaging with different ways of understanding. So it's not just about a graph that we're showing, right, which is a very sort of positivist way of thinking about the future. A current question that I've been having for a while, and I'm not necessarily an expert, is this, but I think we also need to be grappling with this idea of time, sort of as this kind of continuous future, and think of it maybe in a lot of cultures there. It can actually be more looping, right, and circular, and sort of Bergson even. He's a French philosopher. He's not not sort of decolonial in any way, but a very important thinker in unpacking different notions of time. And I think that sort of some of the next frontier tools that we could be using is about making sure that we're not taking these dominant ways that we've been taught to think into the kinds of work that we do. So linear time, for example, because that's what our models need. Sort of our models still need these kinds of things. Just a very simple kind of intervention, and some that we've been working with, again, in IPBES, but with the Indigenous Local Knowledge Task Force, the ILK Task Force, is on identifying indicators and metrics that are important to people. Sort of actually just going into areas and asking them, well, what is important for you, right? What is it that you would actually like to see incorporated in these stories? Not something that I've decided, that actually very much comes from your way of being. And I think that that's another way that you can be a little bit more open. But yeah, these conversations, at least sort of within sort of Western universities and sort of academic thought, are being grappled with at the moment. And there are a few groups that have been sort of talking about decolonial futures, so I think that it's definitely a burgeoning field, and we'll probably be seeing a lot more techniques and sort of tactics, hopefully emerging over the coming years.
Great, Laura. Well, I'm going to ask you a question. As you know, we in TIPSI, we work a lot with policymakers and people inside big agencies, national agencies of innovation or regional agencies. So my question is, have you seen or have you experienced in your work how this future thinking help people that are inside the regime, in a very, very, I don't know, very in this big structure, Have you seen how this working with future help them to not only to imagine alternatives but also to put in practice different way of policy making, of things like that? Do you have this experience?
So I think we're still, again, kind of sitting at at the edge with that. So when we're working through the IPBES process, for example, with governments, just convincing them that this is an important thing to do is already a pretty big step, I think. But I think this is where the participation starts to become important. So what we have done is get policymakers in a room with a lot of innovators, people who are basically living the kinds of futures that they're trying to create. And I think that can spark a sense of excitement and a sense of possibility. Again, it's the process, not just the outcome that you're trying to sort of focus on, where you can see policymakers being like, oh, wow, this could actually be something really cool that we could buy into. We do need to create an enabling environment for this to be able to sort of take off. But I think, honestly, it's been less policymakers and more innovators, and innovators coming together as change makers and sort of really learning from each other and being able to come up with something even fundamentally different from what they've gone before. You know, you're very familiar with the idea of bricolage within innovation. And I think that's been probably a more powerful coming together that we've seen. But I think we need to be doing more work to slowly, I think, bring policymakers on board. So I think kind of hitting them with a completely radical embedded futures process is probably not going to be the best thing, but to slowly start to get these narratives, again, the stories, being able to show the art at the UN is already a step in a direction towards getting them engaged more creatively with the possibilities that are out there. But, you know, as I was saying, breaking down that horizon one, breaking down the regime is always the most difficult, even just to think through, let alone actually to do. And I think that's something that, yeah, that sort of futures thinking has really, really taught me that's where we do need to be focusing actions, but that we can actually come up with some steps. And I think that's important, that we sort of know in some instances what it is that needs to be done, so we can put the pressure on the points where that can happen. I think you're muted, Sandra.
Sorry. I'm checking the chat and there's no more question, but I have another one. So are you putting in contact all these groups working with Future? So because I think one of important steps is working more in a network base, and try to link people from different. So are you working, try to bring together, or in this future field, there is a movement to bring together people working with Future? So more or less, how is this organized, or what kind of initiatives you see?
There are a few more initiatives or networks, mainly more for professionals, not researchers. So like Foresight for Development, there's the international kind of foresight community, and futurist sort of organizations that you can actually apply to belong to. So there definitely are those networks. I think within research or academia that we're starting to get a little bit better at that, particularly through sort of some of these fora like IPBES, where you have kind of an organization that is a bit of a go-to. But I think right now it's just kind of personal connections, and there probably is space for doing something much more sort of concrete in terms of linking futures thinkers together. I think the other component is that, it's not the only job that we do. A lot of us, as you were mentioning, I also do food systems, biodiversity. So sort of we tend to be wearing so many different hats, and none of us have enough time in the day to be able to get things done. But I think that it is important. And I mean, Twitter, there is, I guess, the one thing that I should flag, which is actually a Slack group, again, that was set up by my colleague Joost Vervoort, called Anticipatory Governance Slack. And there he'd gotten actually a lot of early career researchers, but also a lot of established researchers who are working in the space. And that's been really, really successful in kind of bringing people together. But again, that comes through personal connections that you're then able to make that. But I do encourage everyone to look into that. Find them on Twitter. I think we're all using social media a lot for these things. But yeah, so nothing like extremely formal, but I think the links and the networks are growing. But yeah, there's, the kind of funding for that sort of thing is also always a big question, right?
Okay, Laura, I think there are no more questions in the chat. You probably are really tired about this long talk. thanks again for this nice and interesting and new field, no, of people doing things in this transition and transformation world, and hope to keep in contact in some way.
Sure. Thank you so much, Sandra. Lovely to meet everyone. Thank you for the questions. And again, apologies for maybe next time in Spanish. I will try.
It's okay. Thank you. And a few words in Spanish just to finish this connection. Bueno, esta ha sido la primera sesión, ¿no? La primera conferencia sobre trabajo con futuros que hemos tenido ya en el marco del Diploma de Innovación para la Transformación Social y Ambiental. En 3 semanas tendremos una nueva conferencia también, de aquí a 3 viernes, en este mismo horario. Esta conferencia será de Johann Schott, que es uno de los, de los investigadores que más ha trabajado en la perspectiva de las transiciones sociotécnicas, la perspectiva multinivel. Es también profesor del posgrado en Innovación para la Transformación Social y Ambiental, y bueno, y nos dará una conferencia sobre algún aspecto de la innovación para la transformación, que es el tema en el que él y bueno, las personas que estamos trabajando con él en TIPSI, en el Consorcio Internacional de Política Transformativa, pues estamos con este enfoque, ¿no? Intentando cambiar el régimen, trabajando con los policymakers, y bueno, él nos dará su perspectiva sobre la innovación transformativa. Y nada, muchas gracias. Por mi parte, nada. Buenas noches, buenas tardes y nos vemos de aquí a 3 semanas. Muchas gracias.
Buenas noches, gracias. Hasta la próxima.